The air inside the hall was thick with expectation, sweet with cologne, dusted with tobacco smoke, and vibrating with the breathless hush that settles over a crowd just before history cracks open. Under the high domed ceiling of the Library of Congress, every chair was filled, every camera light blinking red. Outside, Washington's late autumn chill wrapped around marble columns like a memory trying to get in. John Kennedy stood at the podium, hands clasped, eyes scanning the room. He wasn't supposed to be here, not tonight, not at this age, and certainly not sharing the stage with one of the most polarizing governors of the modern era, Gavin Newsom. But here he was 40 years old, dressed in a navy suit that hung just slightly off his shoulders, with the unmistakable lineage of a dynasty in his name, and a heart that had never quite caught up with the weight of it. He had the voice soft, yet purposeful, the kind that made even silence lean in. But before he could begin, before a single word left his lips, Gavin Newsom leaned forward from the chair to his left and interrupted him. "John, before you say anything, just one thing," Newsom said, voice sharp like the scrape of a chair. On tile, a ripple moved through the room. 8 seconds. That's how long it took for silence to take hold. Newsom, known for his charisma and political bravado, sat back in his seat. And in those 8 seconds, something shifted, not in the air, but in him. He had come to challenge, to debate, to rise in front of the cameras with his trademark defiance. But now, sitting there, eyes locked on Kennedy's, he could only listen. Because in those 8 seconds, he saw something in the man beside him that startled him. Not power. Not politics-pain. John adjusted the microphone slowly, as if gathering not words but the strength to hold them. The hall remained hushed. Then, he began not with a campaign pitch, not with a policy promise, but with a story. "My father," he said, "used to tell me that politics is history with its sleeves rolled up. But what he didn't say was that history sometimes leaves bruises." His voice trembled, just for a second. The audience leaned in. John F. Kennedy Jr. That's who he was. Though he had spent most of his life trying to be simply John, had grown up in the shadow of a bullet and a blood-stained pink dress. His earliest memory wasn't of a toy or a family trip, it was of his mother's quiet crying behind a bedroom door, and a funeral procession watched from a child's eye view. His life had been shaped not by his choices, but by legacies written before he could spell the word. And yet, he had not gone into politics. Not at first, after years in publishing, flying, seeking his own path. It was a near-fatal plane crash off the coast of Nantucket that changed everything. Surviving that recant, the months of recovery that followed pushed him to reconsider what his name, and his life, could mean. In pain, he found purpose. He emerged quieter, but clearer now, standing before the world again. He had come not to reclaim a family throne, but to rebuild what he believed had been lost in American public life. Empathy. Gavin Newsom hadn't expected this. He had come to debate the revival of the centrist Democratic movement that Kennedy now represented, a movement that, to Newsom, felt like a betrayal of the progressive future he fought for in California. To him, this event had been political theater, but in those first 8 seconds, he had recognized something far more dangerous: sincerity. Still, Newsom wasn't easily moved. He waited for his turn, fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. A habit he'd picked up from the courtroom days of his youth, watching his father, a state judge, render verdicts with no apology. He rose when Kennedy finished his opening. "I don't deny your pain, John," he said, eyes narrowing. "But pain doesn't give you policy. Stories don't build housing. Grief doesn't fight climate change." There it was. The first clash. But Kennedy didn't flinch. "I agree," he said quietly. "But stories make us care enough to try." Outside the auditorium, in a modest cafe tucked between two embassies, two old friends listened to the live stream on a phone propped up between coffee mugs. One was Helen Martinez, a retired nurse from Queens who had marched with the original civil rights movement. The other, her grandson Darius, a Georgetown senior studying political science, wore his skepticism like armor. "You think he means it?" Darius asked. Helen sipped her coffee, eyes on the screen. "He's not pretending," she said. "That's rare, that matters." Back on stage, the discussion had moved from stories to substance. Healthcare, climate, education, immigration, subplot after subplot unfolded not in the sense of narrative, but in lives. Kennedy brought up a 9-year-old boy named Elijah he had met in Mississippi, whose school still used textbooks from the Reagan era. Newsom countered with legislation he'd fought for, funding green infrastructure in low-income neighborhoods in LA, but it wasn't the data points that held the room. It was the unexpected emotional terrain they kept uncovering. During a question on mental health, an issue both had championed differently, Kennedy paused. He spoke about his cousin, David, who had died of a drug overdose in a Florida hotel. He described the way grief mutates when addiction runs through a family, and how silence can rot even the most privileged households. To his credit, didn't interrupt. Instead, for the first time that night, he revealed something rarely heard: the story of his own mother, who had struggled with bipolar disorder. How he had spent hours as a teenager sitting outside her locked door, waiting for the storm to pass. How public stigma had shaped his quiet fury, and how that fury became fuel. And in that moment, something broke open, not between them, but between the past and the present. Outside, the night had deepened. Protesters and supporters alike gathered on the Capitol lawn, their chants drifting faintly through the cool air. The moon hung low, like a witness. Inside, after 2 hours, the moderator asked for final thoughts. Kennedy stood. "This country," he said, "does not need more warriors. It needs more listeners." He turned to Newsom. "I interrupted you once, years ago, when we first met in Boston. I dismissed your passion as naive. I was wrong. I came here tonight, thinking I had to prove myself, but the truth is we're both still trying to be men our fathers would respect. Maybe we should start by respecting each other." There was no applause yet, just stillness. Newsom stood slowly. "I interrupted you tonight," he said. 8 seconds. "And I saw in your eyes that you weren't here for a fight. You were here for something else. I don't know what we just did tonight, but I know it wasn't theater. It was something real. And for once, that's enough." He extended his hand. Kennedy took it. Applause finally broke, not polite, but thunderous, like a dam giving way. That night, the headlines roared. Cable news spun it in every direction. But what mattered wasn't the narrative the media crafted. It was the quiet ripple that moved through living rooms, through dinner tables, through young people who had never heard politicians speak from scars instead of scripts. And as the camera lights dimmed, and staffers packed up, and both men stepped into separate cars headed into different futures, the silence lingered. Not the kind born from interruption, the kind born from understanding, and maybe, in a time when shouting had become the national pastime, that silence was the beginning of something better.